I want to say about Stephen that he is one of the most accomplished people that I have had as a student. He has written 4 books. Is it 4 books?
Yep.
Yeah, including The Cult of Trump, Freedom of Mind. And his dissertation is an attempt to what we call operationalize, or to give a good measurable definition of the BITE model of authoritarian control. And this is a way that we hope in the long run will be available to the legal community to be able to talk about how people have come under authoritarian control and use it perhaps as a defense, or use it as a prosecutorial device to intervene in the lives of really cults. He's done a lot of terrific work on things like sex trafficking and influence legal decisions in many places. And this dissertation is just the beginning, I hope, of a long and distinguished career in research. And so with that, Stephen, go ahead with your presentation.
So I title my dissertation, The BITE Model of Authoritarian Control, Undue Influence, Thought Reform, Brainwashing, Mind Control, Trafficking, and the Law. I guess I want to start out by saying that the problem is that while the law has remedies for when people take away the rights of others, it's mostly involved with bodily harm or money, but not psychological abuse and trauma and such. But as I'll get into my presentation, in my deep literature review, I discovered there were efforts to address this problem from different angles. And my hope in doing this work is to create a tool that the legal community can use to understand what's the difference between ethical and unethical influence. I also want to say it was February of 1974 when I was recruited into a cult called the Moonies, and spent 2.5 years in the cult, dropped out of college, etc. That month, Patty Hearst was kidnapped by force out of her apartment by the Symbionese Liberation Army, was on the lam, was arrested, tried, and sent to jail for robbing a bank and a sporting goods store. And as a form, I was out by that point through a deprogramming, thanks to my family's love and efforts. It always struck me, as I was so lucky not to have committed any crimes. I also wanted to say tomorrow, November 18th, is the anniversary of the Jonestown massacre, with over 913 people, including over 300 children, Congressman Ryan assassinated, and Ron Harris from NBC. So for me, this has been a 44-year full-time quest to try to be an activist and help solve the problems involved with mind control, etc. I always like to use this slide in my presentations to try to make it personal to whoever's listening. And that is, how would you know if you were under mind control, or if you had been unduly influenced? And the truth is it's not so easy, because when I was in the cult, and my sister and brother-in-law who helped rescue me are on this call, they try to tell me I was brainwashed. They try to tell me I was in a cult, but I was in a new reality, a new identity. And in fact, the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, but the 4 had it and 3, names a dissociative disorder that talks about identity disturbance, and explicitly says individuals who have been subjected to intense coercive persuasion, e.g. brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination while captive, torture, long-term political imprisonment, recruitment by sects or cults, or by terror organizations. So a lot of cults have put out this information that there's no such thing, but in fact, clinicians have been encountering this for decades. And the simplest way to explain it is when who I was before the Moonies. I was a Jew from Queens, who wrote poetry and played basketball and liked women. And within a few weeks, I became a right-wing fascist who thought that democracy was satanic. Within a year, I was believing the Holocaust was necessary. I was fasting for Nixon to be president because God wanted him to be president. So for me, this journey has been extremely intense over these years, especially the last 4 years. So I just wanted to say that when you think of cults, a lot of people think of people in robes living in isolated places, and that's not useful. In fact, people are in all types of different one-over-one cults, political cults, therapy cults, religious cults, commercial cults known as trafficking, as well as multi-level marketing groups and large group awareness trainings. When my deprogramming was taking place back in 1976, one of the things that helped me a lot was understanding Chinese communist brainwashing studies. I'm not going to take the time today to explain all of these models, but they're all contained within my dissertation in detail, because I wanted to pull together all of the most prominent theories and models that incorporate undue influence in its varieties of forms. And Lifton has been a mentor, someone I've interviewed multiple times. And in courts of law, Lifton's model, and soon I will get to Margaret Singer's models, have been used in testifying about undue influence. But those were qualitative studies. They were based on interviews with people who had experienced thought reform or brainwashing and such. And as you will find out towards into this presentation, we now have a quantitative study that offers a more concrete model. So in addition to Lifton and Singer, I wanted to add Edgar Schein and his book, Coercive Persuasion, that I read when I first got out. And he presented Kurt Lewin, one of the most famous social psychologists' model of unfreezing, changing, refreezing. Unfreezing means disorienting a person's sense of self. Changing means the indoctrination into a new ideology and a new identity, and then the refreezing of that identity. In 2014, he actually presented a model that he calls coercive persuasion that I wanted to also include in this presentation. You'll see the themes being called out. For me, as I was learning all of these models, I learned about cognitive dissonance theory that was based on the work of social psychologist Leon Festinger, studying a UFO cult where the leader had prophesied that a spaceship would land on a mountain at a particular day and time. And he and his students posited that people would lose faith after the spaceship didn't show up. And in fact, people believed more. And that led to the development of the cognitive dissonance model, which says human beings like to be congruent. They like to have things line up between their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And if you change one, the other two will shift to reduce dissonance. And I love that model. So, and then I was trying to think of a more simple way. And I decided that I could use thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, but there was something else missing, and it was information control. And so I came about this model called the BITE model for those four things. And I decided not to include the slides because there are a lot of details in it, but you can go to my website for the detailed explanation of the BITE model. So I wanted to then, in the lit review, I realized trafficking was passed as a law against enslaving people. And the definition, and I should say the Keith Raniere Nexium cult, he's in jail for 120 years, and he was put in jail because of trafficking laws and not because of undue influence laws, etc. And the government defines fraud, force, fraud, and coercion in terms of trafficking. But this, again, overlaps with the themes of the brainwashing and thought reform literature, the coercive persuasion literature, and of course, the BITE model. And there are quite a few laws that I've included in my dissertation as well. Very interestingly, there has been development in elder law, and there are 5 models there for evaluating undue influence, but it's all pretty much aimed at getting control of someone's assets or property or money. And I'll just mention that susceptibility, opportunity, disposition, and result, the Soder model, figures strongly. Needless to say, they're all describing the same kind of phenomenon of abuse and exploitation by a predator on someone who's vulnerable. And as you see, Margaret Singer's model, the one that I mentioned earlier with the 6 conditions, is cited here as well. And I was shocked to learn that California passed a law on undue influence in 2014. And they actually then created a skilled toolkit for elder care workers to evaluate undue influence with elderly people. And again, it looks at the vulnerability of the victim, the influencer's authority over them, the specific actions or tactics, as well as the taking advantage of the person. In 2015, one of my mentors, a former law professor emeritus, Alan Shefflin, wrote a paper on his social influence model. And he explicitly wrote this for experts, expert witnesses, to be able to have a framework for anyone to evaluate undue influence. It ranges from the influencer to the influencee, and purpose and techniques and timing and setting. And of course, the methods and techniques is where my BITE model falls firmly into that. So I'm not only trying to pull together the existing laws, the existing models on brainwashing and mind control and connect it with the mental health system, but for my study, it's been quite an interesting journey, and I'm now bitten by the research bug. And here's an example of what it looked like, and people would be coding it never to always. Things like, I felt forced to be obedient to leaders and group rules, or I felt pressure to obey even when I disagreed with the rules. So these are some of the behavioral control questions that scored over 0.7. We disregarded the ones that were lower. Information control, the highest thing was evasion, misdirection. Changing the subject was used to avoid critical questions. Lying, especially to outsiders, to advance the group aims. Not honestly answering critical questions. Distorting information. And thought control, asking critical questions was a sin, essentially, or people were in rebellion. And it was always the dogma or the group policy over them as an individual. And there was no other alternative belief systems that offered any validity whatsoever. And I'm not going to read all of them. And I will post the recording of this for those of you who want to go through it more slowly, and the dissertation itself will get published. And emotional controls, essentially phobia indoctrination scored the highest, that if you didn't do what the group wanted you to do, terrible things would happen to you. That scored 0.835. Also, in the mindset of someone in a mind control or authoritarian cult, there was no future. If you ever left, only terrible things would happen. There's no happiness, no fulfillment if you left. And people were taught to block any negative emotions like homesickness or wanting to sleep longer, or not liking to be abused and bullied. So it needs sense that behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control would come up as control. But one of the interesting things in the last 4 years is I've been participating every Wednesday at the program in psychiatry at the law that's associated with Harvard Medical School, and learning from some of the top forensic psychiatrists and psychologists and attorneys who are part of this think tank. And some of them were, Steve, undue influence is a known quantity. Don't mess around with it. It's going to be an uphill battle. Pick a new term and you can define it. It was their advice. And as we did the analysis, it turned out that, oh, let's call it authoritarian control. And I looked it up in the dictionary, and blind submission to authority, suppression of individual thoughts and free will. And I went, Eureka, that's what we're going to call it. So from that moment on, instead of calling it the BITE model of mind control, it's now the BITE model of authoritarian control.